He is a serial killer with many names, notorious for killing between 12 and 24 people in the 1970s and 1980s, though the true number of his victims is still unknown. Sometimes he is called the Bikini Killer for the several victims who were young, bikini-clad women found dead in tide pools of normally scenic Southeast Asian beaches. You might know him as the Serpent, a nickname garnered for repeatedly slipping through the authorities' grasp and even out of several prisons. He has even been called Asia's Charles Manson, as he conned victims and accomplices with friendship, creating a sort of criminal family that enabled his crimes across almost a dozen countries throughout Europe and Asia. But most simply, his name is Charles Sobhraj, and this is the story of how he was caught. Charles Sobhraj was born in Saigon on April 6, 1944, about a decade before Vietnam's French colonizers would be defeated, a turbulent era marked by violence, declining Western rule, the beginning of the country's partition, and boiling communist tensions. His father was an Indian businessman, and his mother was an assistant in his tailoring shop. And when his parents split a few years after his birth, he reportedly felt very rejected by his father, a feeling some theorize would trigger his depravity for most of his life. His mother remarried a French army officer who moved the family to France, where Charles was sent to boarding school. He despised it and ran away twice by sea, making it as far as the Horn of Africa on one of his escapes. He was said to be bright, fluent in multiple languages, a fan of nihilist philosophy, and an experienced practitioner of mixed martial arts. However, he turned to crime at a very young age. By 1963, he was incarcerated for the first time, a trend through his unhappy teen years. Despite his delinquency, Sobhraj grew up into what most saw as a handsome, charming man, with a reputation as a con man and a womanizer. When charm failed, he could rely on pathological lies that would later help him escape from prisons in Afghanistan and Greece. In one case, Sobhraj convinced his younger brother to serve his prison sentence by swapping identities. In the other, he faked appendicitis in prison, managing to creep out of the hospital. In his early 20s, he fell in love and married a chic Parisian girl named Chantal Compagnon. He promised to reform for her, but instead dragged her into his crimes. At one point, they were both arrested, after which she seemingly gave up on their relationship, moving to the US with their daughter, perhaps to escape his influence. In 1972, around the time of the couple's arrest, he was thought to have killed a Pakistani taxi driver, possibly his first murder, which he later confessed to, but ultimately retracted the statement. Some say the loss of his wife and child embittered him, propelling him to riskier, more dangerous crimes. Others attribute his first known killing, or at least the first that directly fits his MO, to have occurred in 1975, the murder of U.S. tourist Teresa Knowlton, who was found in her bikini, drowned just offshore of a scenic beach in the Gulf of Thailand. Another of his victims, Charmaine Carew, would be found dead, similarly adorning only her swimwear. At the time, Knowlton was thought to be acting as a courier for a heroin dealer, and Sobhraj would later defend himself by saying he killed her because of her connection to the drug trade. Many of his victims were small-time drug smugglers or young, idealistic backpackers from Western countries who had set off to find themselves on a hippie trail pilgrimage across Southwest and Southeast Asia. While Sobhraj's true motive for killing the young tourists on the hippie trail is still unknown, he claims to only have killed people who were addicted to drugs or drug smugglers, people he considered criminals themselves. He has also implied that because the trafficking of opium due to Western influence ruined many Asian lives and economies, his lifestyle was a rebellion from European laws and oppression. He has attempted to portray himself as a victim of his dysfunctional family, Western imperialism, and racism. though experts generally believe these rationalizations are not in alignment with his overall psychological framework. Usually, Sobhraj would befriend impressionable explorers, drug them with spiked drinks, rob them of their money, valuables, and passports, and sometimes kill them by varied and brutal methods. Some of his alleged victims were drugged to the point of overdose. Some were drowned. Some were brutalized and covered in gasoline, burned beyond recognition, and dumped on the side of a road. From his ceaseless supply of stolen IDs, the con man had numerous false identities, making international travel easy, especially in the 1970s, when border security measures were less rigorous. He would sometimes use his victims' passports so it wasn't obvious they were missing until long after their disappearance. Many families only knew how to contact them based on the few, slow-arriving postcards they might send home. Along the way, Sobhraj met a young French-Canadian nurse named Marie-Andrée Leclerc in India, who was instantly besotted with him. She would later write of their meeting, "I swore to myself to try all means to make him love me, but little by little, I became his slave." He enlisted her as an accomplice, using her medical skills to help drug his victims and convince them that they had caught a tropical bug, trapping them in his apartment. The pair traveled to Bangkok in the mid-1970s, where his murders escalated, with estimates of at least 6 victims in 1975 alone. Here is also where his web of terror began to unravel. In 1976, as a 32-year-old Sobhraj was in the midst of his murder spree, Herman Nippenberg, a junior diplomat of the same age, was working at the Dutch embassy in Bangkok, where he received a letter from the Netherlands. A concerned man was looking for his sister-in-law and her boyfriend. The couple, Henricus Bintanja and Cornelia Hemker, were traveling throughout Asia and had been ardent correspondents, religiously writing to their families twice a week throughout their journey. However, no one had heard from them in over 6 weeks. Nippenberg thought the situation quite bizarre, but remembered that several weeks prior, 2 bodies had been found, charred beyond recognition on a road about 50 miles north of Bangkok. Initially, they were thought to be missing Australian backpackers, but that duo had resurfaced, leaving the possibility that the bodies were those of the disappeared Dutch couple. He found a Dutch dentist based in Bangkok to use dental records to identify the bodies, and to their dismay but not surprise, it was a match. On March 3, 1976, Nippenberg also went to the police morgue, which he would later say was still the most shocking thing he ever saw in his long career, a sight that filled him with a passion to bring their killer to justice. The badly mutilated bodies had been put back together as best as possible to try to understand what had happened to them before their death. The results were unimaginable. The autopsy showed the woman's skull and brain had been bashed in with a heavy object, while the man had been strangled. Both had still been alive when they were covered with an accelerant and set on fire. Nippenberg also remembered hearing a strange, coincidental story from a friend at a Belgian embassy. A young Belgian administrative attaché had learned of a collection of passports belonging to missing people after a French jewelry dealer named Alain Gauthier claimed to have found them in his Bangkok apartment. 2 of the passports were Dutch. Nippenberg forced the attaché to reveal his informant, learning it was a Frenchwoman named Nadine Giray, who lived in the same building with the supposed gem dealer. Nippenberg questioned Giray, who had begun to fear Alain Gauthier murdered the individuals who lost their passports. She even remembered seeing the Dutch couple at his apartment. Authorities would later learn that Alain Gauthier was one of Sobhraj's many aliases. An unsung hero, Giray would go on to take helpful evidence from his apartment and aided as many as 3 of his captives in fleeing Bangkok. On March 11, 1976, Giray called Nippenberg to warn him that Alain Gauthier and his girlfriend Monique were leaving Thailand. Authorities stormed the apartment and took Sobhraj in for questioning under his assumed alias. However, Sobhraj had inserted his picture into a victim's U.S. passport and was released. By the next morning, Sobhraj and Leclerc were long gone, leaving Knippenberg depressed but determined to continue his search, with such a mania that the Dutch ambassador ordered he take a 3-week leave. Before leaving, Knippenberg and his wife, who was also very devoted to the case, put together a portfolio now known as the Knippenberg Cachet, delivering them to international embassies across Bangkok. When he returned, he was contacted by the Canadian ambassador, who learned that police had been in contact with Marie-André Leclerc's parents. The only emergency number she had left was for a contact near Marseille, France. When the French police inquired about Leclerc's emergency contact, they found it was Charles Sobhraj's mother. Now, they had his name as well. But time was increasingly of the essence. The landlord of Sobhraj's Bangkok apartment was itching to put it back on the market. So Knippenberg put together a team to survey the scene before crucial evidence was lost. While in Sobhraj's lair, they found over 10 pounds of medicine and other drug-filled containers with laxatives and powerful sedatives. They also found the murdered Dutch woman's coat and handbag. On May 5, 1976, armed with new evidence, Knippenberg was given permission to go to the press with the story, which ran across front pages throughout Bangkok for days. Thai authorities finally rallied to action, alerting Interpol to the serial killer on the loose. Now, the entire world was watching for the dangerous man the media had just named the Serpent. Sobhraj was running from the law around the world, but it would still be several months before he was caught. Sobhraj and Leclerc spent a brief time in Malaysia before traveling by car towards New Delhi, arriving around June 1976. Sobhraj was already notorious in India for earlier crimes, and authorities were now charging him with killing 2 foreigners on Indian soil that year as well. In need of funds, Sobhraj pulled an elaborate stunt, attempting to rob a group of 60 French students, poisoning them with capsules he claimed were antibiotics, but were actually filled with sleeping pills and laxatives. The magnitude of the crime drew the attention of the hyper-vigilant authorities, leading to Sobhraj's capture in New Delhi on July 5, 1976. He was arrested on robbery and murder charges. Sobhraj was sentenced to 7 to 12 years in Tihar, a prison in New Delhi. Life in prison wasn't so bad for Sobhraj, who was afforded special privileges as he rose to the top of the social hierarchy by bribing or blackmailing guards and leveraging his wealth and legal knowledge with other inmates. Even better, while he was in an Indian jail, he could not be extradited to Thailand, where he would face murder charges that could be punishable by death. Leclerc, who was also jailed for her part in the crimes, was diagnosed with fatal ovarian cancer in 1983 and released to return to her family in Canada for her final days. On March 17, 1986, with only a few weeks until his release, Sobhraj orchestrated an escape from Tihar by giving the guards sweets laced with sedatives. Once again, the Serpent was on the loose. However, the move seemed to be largely strategic. A few weeks later, he was captured while he sipped beer in the seaside resort of Goa to celebrate his 42nd birthday, according to reports from the Associated Press. Sobhraj was given an extended sentence in India until 1997, conveniently, just after the statute of limitations ran out for his crimes in Thailand, so he could no longer be extradited for them. After serving his time in India, Sobhraj was free again. He returned to Paris and lived comfortably, with a relative amount of celebrity. In 2003, for unexplained reasons, Sobhraj traveled to Nepal, where he had committed at least 2 murders during his spree. A journalist in Kathmandu recognized him, though he was by no means hiding. He had in fact broadcast his very public arrival, and he was arrested again. Knippenberg's original documents were crucial in the trial, specifically, testimony he collected many years prior from an ex-girlfriend who was with Sobhraj in Nepal. Sobhraj was finally sentenced to life in prison. Ever the ladies' man, he reportedly got engaged to his lawyer's daughter during the trial. She was 20 and he was 64. Some speculate Sobhraj went back to Nepal, one of the only countries where he was still wanted, needing to bolster his ego, overconfident in his own ability to evade the law as he had done so many times before. While most of his alleged accomplices are missing or have since died, as of late 2020, Sobhraj was still imprisoned in Kathmandu. There are reports that his health is failing, though there is no indication Nepalese law enforcement will release him early. Nippenberg, whose fixation with the case was considered highly eccentric even for all the good it did in the end, believes that because many of the murders remain unresolved, he still cannot feel a sense of closure. He has said, "This isn't over for me until he is in a better world, or I am in a better world. I don't take anything for granted." Even now, he may wonder if the serpent could slither free of his chains once again.